Good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with my family tonight. My name is Luke Chandler, and I'm in the Tampa, Florida area, and I've been there for a little over 10 years now, working with the North Terrace Church of Christ in Temple Terrace. And for most of the time I've been there, this congregation, has supported my work, my family, in that time, and we are very grateful for that. I want this evening to just tell you a little bit about what we're doing and then go ahead and present a lesson as well tonight. First of all, it's a pleasure. I want to thank the elders for allowing me to come. My family, my in-laws live in this area. My wife's family worship with the Wilsonville congregation down Highway 280 going east. And when they come up here, I'm often not with them because I'm traveling somewhere. And if I'm gone for any length of time, I'm involved in traveling to Spanish-speaking countries sometimes, like Colombia or Spain. And when I go, my family usually comes up here because we have 5 children, and it's a lot to watch, a lot of energy. And she has a lot of her family here. It's a chance to be with family and to get some help as well, rather than be alone down there by herself a lot of the time in Florida. And so I don't get to be here as often as she does, but I'm very happy to be here with you tonight, to have this opportunity, and thank you for having me here. It's been several years since I've been here, in large part just due to circumstance. But I want to thank the elders for having me here, for allowing me to speak to you tonight, and also, again, for the support that's been given to us over the years. It has been decisive in our ability to stay there and to work there. The congregation where I preach, it's a bilingual congregation. What it means is that we worship in Spanish and English. The majority of our members are just like, I guess, most of you are, born and raised in the USA. But roughly a third of our membership was born in another country and lives in that area now. We have some members from Colombia, from the Dominican Republic. Right now we have a member from Spain. We've recently had a member from Cuba, from Panama, and we've had members from Peru, and we have someone from Mexico right now. We've had a lot of people from Mexico in the past, and El Salvador, and a lot have come and gone over the years. As any congregation, there is turnover. People leave and go to live in a different area for work reasons or family reasons. Sometimes people fall away, unfortunately. And we've certainly been consistent with that as well. We've had a lot of members leave looking for work over the years as the economy's struggled in recent years. But we've also had some stay for the entire time. And we worship together in one assembly. Some congregations that have a Spanish-speaking population have maybe a separate assembly in Spanish. Because the language difference is a big barrier. But we take a different approach, and we worship together in the same assembly. We're able to do that, for one, because we have several who can translate, and that, of course, is a very important thing. But we look back in the New Testament, and we see that people, Christians back then, didn't worship in separate congregations based on their ethnicity, their language, or their social class. And we know that we had slaves and citizens and free people and Gentiles and Jews and Samaritans all became Christians. But we don't have Samaritan churches and Jewish churches meeting in the same area but at separate times. We don't have Gentile groups and Jewish churches meeting separately from one another. We don't have the slaves with their own congregation because the free people and the owners and the masters want to have their own separate assembly. Everyone's together in the same group. And that's one of the beautiful things about the gospel. It was designed to cut through all the ways we separate ourselves in the world. And some of them we do ourselves, some of them we are just simply due to background, such as language. We can't help that, at least not the language we're born speaking or raised speaking. But the gospel was designed to bring everyone together, to unite people who are divided in all sorts of ways. And there are challenges that come with the approach we're taking, but there are also benefits that come with it. And we're blessed, again, with several who can translate. And so we're able to worship in one assembly together. We have, the way we do it now, we have
several men who can translate, and they take turns, some of them do, sitting in the back, and they give simultaneous translation. While we're speaking English like I am right now, one of our translators is in the back speaking into a microphone, listening to me, translating into a microphone, and those who need the translation have an earbud, have an earpiece. Kind of like the United Nations. You see them with their headphones on, nodding or shaking their heads or looking bored. We don't have the bored-looking reaction, I don't think. But we're able to be together in the same group, and those who don't understand the English can follow what's happening and listen to it as it's being spoken. And so we're able to be together. We sing from two different psalm books. We have an English book and a Spanish book. And we sing about half and half from each. And Spanish, fortunately, is very easy to pronounce once you learn a few basic rules. It's much more consistent than English is. How many ways do you pronounce the letter A in English? Just think about it. And each vowel has multiple pronunciations in English. It's nasty if you're trying to learn English. But Spanish is so easy. Every vowel has one sound every time. And most consonants have just one sound every time. And so it's very easy to pronounce. But we have translations of our songs that while we're singing. And so whether we're singing in one language or the other, everyone knows what it is they're singing. And it actually works very, very well. And it has for a long time. We're thankful for that. We've had several baptisms recently. If you read the reports I've been sending, if you're able to look at those, we've had 4 baptisms in the past 2 months. And so one of those baptisms has been my daughter Laura, who's here tonight, our oldest daughter. We've had 3 other baptisms as well, and so it's always nice to have a fresh rush of spiritual energy, refreshment that comes from that. And so we're thankful for that news as well, and I'm happy to share that with you. As far as some of the things I do, I'm an evangelist at the congregation. I'm also a deacon at the congregation. We have 2 elders, and we've had an eldership since before I was there. Recently, just a few months ago, one of our elders stepped down and dissolved the eldership. It was due to some personal situations, nothing with sin, thankfully, and no family problems. It was nothing like that. But we're blessed to be in a position we were able to reestablish the eldership just a few weeks ago with another man. And so the deacons were also reestablished at the same time. So we have the maturity and the depth to be able to continue with a new eldership and continue to be organized in that way as the Bible designs, as the Bible instructs us. And so that leadership in place, that scriptural leadership, is a great stabilizing factor and brings a lot of stability to the work, as it does anywhere. The Lord's design is, His wisdom is very apparent when we follow it, isn't it? But we have a number of young people. We have classes, Bible classes for all ages. And I teach right now one of the teenage class there. We also have 2 separate adult classes. This is the one place where we divide by language. The English and Spanish adult classes. Because when you're in a class, you're often interacting back and forth. Questions and comments and answers. And to translate all that as it's happening gets difficult. Translate questions and answers and responses. And really you can only cover half the material. When you say everything twice, it takes twice as long to say everything, doesn't it? And so we do separate our adult Bible classes into an English class and a Spanish class. And that works very well. And I've taught both. I often teach both. At this moment, we have enough college students that we're able to offer a separate college class for the 2nd year in a row for our college students. We have students from Florida College and from the University of South Florida, which is very close by. And so we're a rather diverse group, age-wise, from the nations we come from, but our goal is to be together. And we, thankfully, and thanks to God, and thanks to a lot of great servants in the church there, we're able to accomplish that goal of being together. I realized a few years ago that we actually have something of a scriptural example about how to handle language differences in the congregation. There's a difference, but back in the New Testament times, in the 1st century, wouldn't it be pretty normal, if we think about it, to walk into a congregation and hear someone speaking in spiritual tongues? That doesn't happen anymore. But there are instructions for that in the Bible, aren't there, in 1 Corinthians? If someone is speaking in a tongue, make sure it's translated. And while the reasons for the language are different now, we realize that that is perhaps a direction for us as well. We're able to translate, thankfully. And so we do that. And so maybe in one sense, we're following that. We're inspired by that New Testament example and that command. So, but our work is, in spite of a lot of turnover and transition, we have a good group. We have around 90 right now. Not as big as this congregation. But we've usually maintained around 90 plus or minus over the years. Even though we've lost a lot of people, we've had others come in and we've had baptisms. And so that's a stabilizing factor. And we're able to continue to offer all of our Bible classes. We have enough people to teach those classes. So it's been a big blessing for us. And you have been a big part of that. Thank you again. Because the fruit of our work down in Tampa at North Terrace, you have a share in that fruit. If I can use the analogy, you've invested in that work. And so the returns, the profit that comes from that work goes to your account as well. And so the Lord, who keeps our accounts, knows that you have fruit in the work we're doing down in Tampa. And so I hope that encourages you, and I hope that this visit encourages you as well. We appreciate what you do. We appreciate how you've chosen to involve yourselves in our work. And thank you again to the elders here for continuing to make that happen. If you have any questions about the work we do, please talk to me afterwards. Or you can talk to my wife, whom I've not introduced yet. I just realized my wife, Melanie, is here. And our children, I'll go ahead and introduce them. Our oldest daughter is Laura. She's 11 years old. And then Caleb is 9. Megan is 7. And Megan actually has gotten to know Ellie somehow over the summer when they were up here visiting, so connection there. We have our son Noah, who is 4 years old, and our youngest son Samuel, who is 2. And we're done, by the way. At least that's our plan. So we're not looking to make new tribes or anything. We limit our application of the Old Testament to things pertaining to Jesus, not to family planning. So, not looking to Jacob as our example. No, it's a wonderful family. We're very blessed to have our children and to be all together here with you tonight. Again, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to ask me afterward. And if you're in the Tampa area, I hope you will stop by and let us get to know you, let the church get to know you, and have a chance to see what we do and the way we do it in person. We're very close to Florida College. If you're down there for any reason at all, we're actually one of the closest congregations to the campus. I believe we're the second closest, if you want to measure it by miles. So, but we're convenient for much of the Tampa area. And so you're very welcome to join us and be with us. I'd like to present some thoughts tonight, a lesson I preached recently in North Terrace. Now, I was reading and studying about something, and I had a question arise in my mind. I guess I'd wondered a bit, I'd instinctively thought about it, but hadn't really just said it to myself or asked myself this question. And excuse the formatting thing there. Computers don't always speak each other, don't always translate perfectly, to the way the things line up. But I think most of this will be just fine. The Tower of Babel. I think most of us know that story. The Tower of Babel. Languages were mixed. Why is that story in the Bible? Now, I ask this because when we look in the Old Testament, we look at the creation and the flood, and we look at the family lists, the genealogies, and we look at Abraham, and we look at the law of Moses. We can see Jesus in all these things. Creation gives us the identity of God and His nature, and Jesus as well, and we learn about later. The flood, in Genesis teaches us, the origin of sin and the problem Jesus came to solve. We have our first prediction of Jesus and His purpose as the Messiah in Genesis chapter 3. And we go through, we can look at these other famous stories, and they all connect to Jesus in some way. The plot of the Bible, the story, sin, the separation, and how God brings us back into a relationship with Him. The question, though, is the Tower of Babel. Why is that story in there? Because you read it, I read it, and I don't see immediately any real connection to Jesus. I don't see a prophecy. And maybe we can look at the increased division with the languages. But it's harder, at least for me, to see how that story fits in with all the others. We know why we're told about the creation. We know why we're told about the flood and Noah. Because it's resetting the world, but the problem of sin remains. And God won't destroy the world anymore, So how's he going to solve the problem of sin besides wiping the world clean again? Jesus is the answer to that. And the law of Moses is rich with analogies to Jesus and prophecies of Jesus. And the Psalms and the prophets speak extensively of Jesus. And of course, we'd be amiss if we didn't mention David and all the history of him and his descendants, the kings, all ancestors of Jesus, and how it's all pointing to a Messiah, one king who will come from David, who will build a house that will be a very different one than what David was wanting to build. All these things. But why is the Tower of Babel in there? It seems to be, at least at first read, maybe just an odd historical note, maybe an aside, maybe a footnote that someone wants to stick in there because it's so interesting. Why is the Tower of Babel in there? How does that connect to Jesus? Or does it connect to Jesus? What I'd like to do, it's short. Let's read it again, freshen up on it, and then we'll look at some things. We'll at the Tower of Babel and why it may be in there. Starting in Genesis 11, we'll just read the first 9 verses. This is after the flood. People have begun to repopulate the earth. Here we go. The whole earth had one language, the same words. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly." So mud bricks is what we would call this today. They had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Well, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people. They all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. They left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. From there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Okay, short story, interesting story. They want to build a big tower, make a name for themselves. The Lord says, And the way to do that? Confuse their languages. They can't work together anymore, and so they split up. And the name itself, Babel, artifacts of this story are still in our language, aren't they? I mean, some people have accused me of babbling from the pulpit before. I'm sure no one's accused Bob of that. But a babbling, what do we call those little creatures whose talk we cannot yet understand? Babies. That B consonant is in there still. And what did the Greeks call anyone who couldn't speak Greek? A barbarian. See, that B consonant is still there. And if someone's talking on, we sometimes may go blah, blah, blah. See how that B consonant is still in our language, an artifact from this event, and we still use it today. So that's neat, maybe. That's historical. But why is this in the Bible? The Bible uses the B consonant too. That B syllable is in the Greek word for book. But I'm not going to try to get too much in trying to explain all these things. I guess the vowels change, and maybe that changes things. But telling of something, a biblos, a Bible, a book, telling of something. But when you can't understand it, blah, 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 right? But anyway, Babel. And Babylon got its name from this as well. The land of Shinar where this happened is ancient Babylon in Iraq today. But why is this story in the Bible? Why is this there? Does it illuminate Jesus in some way like all of the other stories do? The Spirit's looking at history. Which stories are we going to preserve for God's people? Let's see. Creation, yes. The flood, obviously. And Abraham, definitely, because the promises of Jesus. And Tower of Babel, yes. Nothing about the dinosaurs. Nothing about so many things you might have questions about. I want more specifics, please. No, the Bible doesn't preserve most of those stories. It preserves this one. Why? Why is this Babel story in there? Well, maybe we picture how that tower would have looked. And this is where the archaeology can actually help us. I'm a student of archaeology. I actually practice some archaeology too, as a few of you know. But we often picture the Tower of Babel, maybe something like that. That is in fact not what it looks like. And we know that from archaeology. That is how people in the Middle Ages in Europe began visualizing it. You know, how do you visualize the Tower of Babel? Well, you think of what do buildings look like in my experience, and we impose that on the story. We actually have from archaeology probably an idea of what the tower would have looked like, at least to some degree, maybe a great degree. We call it a ziggurat, and some of you have read about these. These are large mud brick buildings in the ancient land of Shinar. And that whole region we call Iraq, Mesopotamia, throughout history. And they are massive temples. This one, the top courses are not preserved anymore. But there's a reconstruction of how a complete one might have looked back in the day. This is actually how the ancient city of Babylon would have looked. There is a massive ziggurat in the city of Babylon. But we know there are other ziggurats in other cities before Nebuchadnezzar's time and Daniel's time. But let's look at the roof level of the city. And then look at that one tall one there, the ziggurat. See, if your experience is entirely those smaller buildings, how does this building look? Now we look at that and we think that doesn't stretch to the heavens. You know, you need to look to the Freedom Tower in New York City, or what used to be called the Sears Tower in Chicago. What's it called now? I forget. Or some of these huge buildings around the world, the skyscrapers. Those go to the heavens. But let's remember that 100 years ago, 20 stories was considered a skyscraper. And today, 20 stories is nothing, because our experience gives us a different perspective to measure by. If your experience is these other buildings in the city, then you look at that, and nothing else in the city is like that. And maybe we get the idea, wow, that scrapes the sky. And 150 years ago, something that tall did scrape the sky in our country. Until we got different engineering methods. And now we can build much, much higher. And now those things scrape the sky. But how tall was the Tower of Babel intended to be? Maybe something like this, maybe bigger. We don't know, and it doesn't matter. Because the point of the story is not how tall it was. But we found enough of these and enough inscriptions in these that we can read. We know what this is about. What was the purpose of a ziggurat? Was the Tower of Babel like this? Probably. So what was the purpose of it? And here's how we can learn something more. These towers, that top room, see that top room, that blue thing with the door right there? Right there? Know what was in there? Priests for these ziggurats kept them furnished with a bed and a table with food on it. And that was so that the god whom that ziggurat was built for could come down and hang out in that room and eat a meal and sleep and rest. Those temples were to try to bring God, or the god that they were worshiping, down to them from heaven. Give him a place to stay and a place to eat. He'll come down and dwell among us. The purpose of a ziggurat is to bring God to people. And when we look at it in that sense, when we look at it from that perspective, what's the Tower of Babel? What's the purpose of it? The Tower of Babel was not built so people could climb up to be with God in heaven. And the text doesn't say that was the purpose either. If we look at these ziggurats, they were built to get God to come down to them. And in this case, in the Tower of Babel story, they want God to come down to them so they can make a name for themselves. Not for His glory, but for theirs. Doesn't that really illuminate the story some more now? The archaeology. And look at their purpose. Let's build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens so that we can make a name for ourselves. They want God to dwell with them for their own glory. That was the reason for them building the tower. They didn't want to climb up to God. They wanted God to come down to them. And if you look at that, though, isn't that the story of the Bible? Think about it. The Tower of Babel was humanity's response to losing the presence of God. Because God wasn't always separated from humanity, was He? God was originally down here in the Garden of Eden. And when He was separated, people want to reestablish that connection. Their effort was an attempt to bring God down to them, though for the wrong reasons. It wasn't so they could bask in God's glow. It wasn't so they could be uplifted by God's presence. It's so they could be glorified themselves. Look at us. We have God with us. Aren't we great? Aren't we better than everyone else? Aren't we powerful? They were trying to harness God for their own purposes. But it's a misguided response to the problem of the whole Bible to begin with. Losing God's presence. And in that context, this is a key part of the Bible story. What's the whole point of the Bible? Reconnecting with God after losing Him. Because can God dwell somewhere? God dwells in heaven. But when we look at the Scriptures, people are always trying to get God to dwell here. And actually, if we look at it more carefully, God did dwell here. I think we remember the story. God is omnipresent. He's not limited or confined to a space. And we get that. He's spirit. He's not a physical being that we can just box in somewhere. But the Bible speaks of God dwelling in places. Maybe one of the more dramatic examples is at Mount Sinai. When Israel got there, thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, a very loud trumpet blast. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because why? The Lord had descended on it. He's there in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, the whole mountain trembling. What a dramatic effect for God dwelling in a place. We find God dwelling, His presence represented many times by fire and smoke and things like that in the Bible. And Solomon understood this, the wisest man of all. He built a house for God, and yet he understood that a house really cannot hold God. Though maybe God can enter the house, but cannot hold Him. Well, God indeed dwell with man on the earth. He writes in 2 Chronicles 6. Behold, the heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. When He's dedicating the temple, He admits in His dedication ceremony, nothing on earth can hold God in a space. And yet, sometimes God does dwell. We go back at where God dwells and look at the history of the Bible. Maybe we can begin with the book of John. Chapter 1. In the beginning of everything was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him. There's creation. But then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in verse 14. We've seen His glory. God did, in the form of Jesus, come down to dwell in a place and in a body amongst us. So God can do it. He did it at Sinai, apparently. He did it in the form of Jesus. We go on and we see that He did it in the Garden of Eden as well, at the very beginning. Remember after Adam and Eve ate the fruit they were not supposed to eat? Their eyes were opened. But then after that, it says in Genesis 3, verse 8, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of day. And they hid themselves from His presence. It's interesting that before the fall, God can be there with them in the garden. God created us to exist with Him. But we learn from the story, God cannot exist with sin and rebellion. And it's interesting also that the sound of God in the garden was not strange to them. When they heard the sound of God, they didn't say, well, never heard that before. They recognized it. They apparently knew the sound already. Before that sin, God dwelt with them in the garden. And they knew it. They had experienced it. And now here He comes again. But something's changed this time. And this is the beginning of the separation. They have to leave the garden and go away. And then God is separated from humanity at this point. And we had the problem of the Bible, trying to reconnect us with God in His presence. God was there originally. And Babel was an attempt to regain His presence, like in the Garden of Eden, but for their own glory. And but that's the whole problem in the Bible. And we see it begin there. We can fast forward. God provides maybe hints of a solution. Did God ever dwell on earth before Jesus? Yes, He did. We go forward to the wilderness after the Exodus from Egypt and Moses. They go out. And what's God tell them in Exodus 25? Let the people make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell in their midst. Hey, it's the Garden of Eden again. God's going to come down and dwell with us again. And we have a tabernacle. But it's not just as simple as all that. It's not quite like the Garden of Eden. There's some different things about it. For one, God actually dwelt in one of the objects in the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant. Before Indiana Jones found it, God was in the Ark of the Covenant. And what is the Ark of the Covenant? It was a wooden box covered in gold. And when it's carried around anywhere, covered by a big blue cloth so no one can actually see it. And when it's not being carried around, it's in the tabernacle behind a very thick veil, like this thick, several feet thick possibly, inside a tent. And that tent itself is also surrounded by a fence. So God's in the middle of His people, And yet how many barriers are there? There's the wooden box, and the gold, and maybe the blue cloth, and the veil, and the Holy of Holies, and the tabernacle tent itself, and another fence around it. There are 6 layers of separation between God's presence and the people. So God's there, but He's still blocked off. See, they have God's presence there, but there's still the separation there. It's not the same. He's not walking amongst them. He's not really with them. He's in the Ark of the Covenant, inside the place that no one can go into, except the high priest only one time a year. So see how much God's there with them, and He follows them around. He's in their midst in the wilderness, and yet He's still always separated from them. Even though He's right there with them, He's still separated by all these layers. And when they get to Canaan, it really didn't get any better. In fact, God kind of wandered around in Canaan. Look at the history of the Ark of the Covenant. It didn't just stay in one place the whole time. The Ark of the Covenant resided in different places. When they first got there, they pitched the tabernacle at a place called Shiloh, or Shiloh as we often pronounce it. Shiloh. And the Ark was there for several hundred years. But then it was captured by the Philistines. There are the ruins of ancient Shiloh. And that flat area that marked up there, it's an artificially flattened area, and many think that's where the tabernacle would have been. It's the only flat place big enough to hold the tabernacle with its dimensions. And so that may have been the place where the ark dwelt during the Judges period, we call it. And so God dwelt there on that hill somewhere, maybe right there in that spot, for several hundred years. But then the Philistines captured the ark. And if we look at the clues, they apparently burned down the tabernacle too, because the Ark of the Covenant never went back there again. When they came back from the Philistines, it went to a place called Bet Shemesh, on the border with the Philistines. The Philistines took it, didn't go very well, plagues and boils and things. So they sent it back on a cart, and the Bible says it came out. Here's a picture I took from Bet Shemesh. And one of those fields out there, the ark came to stop in that field, pulled by a cart. And the field of Joshua of Bet Shemesh, out there somewhere in this view of this photo. The ark stood there for a little bit, but they didn't stay there very long, because you can't just leave the ark in a field. And so they didn't take it back to Shiloh. Apparently it was destroyed at that point. They took it to someone's house. The men of Kiryat Jearim. Yeah, it just flows off the tongue, doesn't it? Yeah, these names. The men of Kiryat Jearim, a town west of Jerusalem. Some guys from there came and took up the ark of the Lord, brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. That's the hill right there. Somewhere up there, God's presence dwelled for a while, until the time of David. And then David brought it to Jerusalem and put it in a tent there, and then Solomon finally built a house for it, right? And this is how that area where the ark dwelt looks today. It's all the Temple Mount, it's all Muslim places now. But that was Jewish holy ground before, and that's where the presence of God dwelt for a long time. Somewhere, maybe on the spot of that golden domed building, that we can't be sure exactly. But God's presence wandered around Canaan, different places, always in a tent, and always still separated from the people by all those layers surrounding it. Well, eventually, look what it said in 1 Chronicles 17, talking about this place to place to place. I've not dwelt in a house since the day that I brought up Israel to this day. I've gone, the Lord says, I've gone from tent to tent, from one dwelling place to another. God's just moving around all the time, but He's still separated from everyone the whole time. Well, Solomon built the temple. It's a permanent place, and it's an interesting event. When Solomon dedicated the temple, the glory of the Lord, like this big smoke cloud sort of a thing, the glory of the Lord came in and filled the building. God's dwelling there again, inside the building. And that's wonderful. I wish you could have seen that. And there's the building, how it looked from the descriptions we have in the Bible. And God's glory filled that building, and He dwelt there, but not forever. Because in Ezekiel, shortly before it was destroyed, Ezekiel has a vision 3.5 centuries later, and in this vision, the glory of God came out of the temple and left behind an empty building. So God didn't dwell there anymore. And later on, skipping ahead, they came back and rebuilt the temple, but we never had the glory coming back and filling it again. And later on, Herod the Great rebuilds the temple on a massive scale, and that's the temple of Jesus' time. But the glory of God never filled that temple either, like it had Solomon's temple, and like it had the tabernacle before that. And there's this, you see the temple in the middle there, and that massive area around it, people to worship and come close to God's presence, and yet God's glory never entered that building. Maybe it's fair to say that God never actually dwelt there. The Ark of the Covenant was long gone by the time that building was built, so that box that carried God's presence wasn't even there either. God never inhabited that building. Now when God came down in the form of Jesus, He was around there, but Jesus never entered that white building either, with the gold all over it. He went to the Temple Mount and walked around those big open areas and taught there and worshiped there, but He was not a Levite, and He constrained Himself to the law of Moses. Only priests can go in there. And Jesus was not one of those Levitical priests. Jesus, God in the flesh, dwelling among people, never entered that house. So did Jesus solve the problem? He never entered His dwelling place. Well, yeah, He did. Jesus did enter a better temple. His name, after all, was Emmanuel, right? Isaiah chapter 7 predicted Emmanuel, which means God with us. The name Emmanuel, that's the solution to the problem. Reconnect him with God. Not like the Tower of Babel, but God's finally with us again. Emmanuel. And He lived up to it, but not in that old temple. Not in that big temple Herod built. God was not with him in that building. The Lord, Jesus, entered a better temple. He does dwell. Look at 1 Peter 2, verse 5. This problem that's been vexing humanity since the Garden of Eden and through the Tower of Babel and all these other stories. Peter gives us a solution. You yourselves, Christians, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. Who lives in the spiritual house? The Lord. The Lord dwells in us. We're the stones of His church. The church is living stones, a new building where God finally dwells with us again, like we were always meant to be with Him. 1 Corinthians 3:16, what does Paul say? Don't you know you are God's temple? God's Spirit dwells in you. And we can also look in chapter 6. Don't you know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You're not your own. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Glorify God in your temple. Every one of us who is a Christian, every one of you who is a Christian, you are the solution that the Tower of Babel was trying to seek. Wrongly, wrong-headedly. But you and I, as Christians, we're the solution to everything. And not because of us. God made us the solution to everything. You see, we were originally designed to dwell with God. Even on the earth. God dwelt with Adam and Eve. That was the design. The original plan was for people to be on earth and God to dwell with us. And then it was broken, and God couldn't dwell with us anymore. And when He did, separation, barriers, a wooden box with all the layers between. Jesus in the flesh, but only in that spot, in that one body, with the limitations that came with it. But now, we have the solution. If God lives in you, you're actually living the way we were originally intended to live. We were not designed to be separated from God. We have been, but that wasn't the design. Isn't it a wonderful thing? When we think about it in this way again, refresh ourselves on this thought that He is with us, that we are the solution to this problem in the whole Bible. In Revelation 21, this wonderful statement, the tabernacle of God is among men. He will dwell among them. They shall be His people. God Himself will be among them. A new tabernacle. And one without all the separation. In fact, I didn't put this on the slide, but you know that New Jerusalem that comes down at the end of Revelation? That city that comes down, New Jerusalem, with the gates, the pearly gates. It's adorned, like a bride for a wedding. That's not actually talking about heaven. It's talking about us. Who's the bride? We're the bride of Christ. And that city is adorned as a bride. That's a hint as to its identity. That city is us. And in Revelation, God dwells in that city. Where does God dwell? He dwells in us. We are the fulfillment of that New Jerusalem. And whether it's a tabernacle or a New Jerusalem, do we see ourselves this way? And maybe we've seen ourselves and no doubt heard a lot of these verses before. But think freshly again tonight that as a Christian, if you're a Christian, you are the solution to everything. God's made you the solution and made me the solution. He dwells in us. This is the way it was supposed to be from the beginning. And we're living in the way it was always intended to be. And people sought for it. They reached for it. Rightly and wrongly, they searched for God. Dwell with us. Come down and be here. Whether wrong-headedly like the Tower of Babel, whether honestly like so many who sought God and turned to Him, but He was not there. Or when He was there, separated and partitioned. But now He lives in you and me. And that is what people longed for thousands of years. What you and I have. What does this mean? We're not here to do the things that we often dedicate our lives to. See, we have careers, and we enjoy life as we are able to, on whatever level that is. But that's not why we were put here. That's not why we're here. That's not why we exist. If God dwells in me, I'm living by the original design for humanity. Humanity was not put down here originally to have a career or have a farm or have this life with a job and create a family and live contentedly with the family and then die when it's time. That's not why we were put here. Those are the things we seek. Those are the things we plan for. But those aren't really the things that we were designed for. We were designed, whatever our life circumstance, wherever we live, whomever we live it with, whatever place we live, whatever people we have in our family or don't have in our family. We're put here to dwell with God, to be with Him and to have Him be with us, and to bring others into that same relationship. That's why we're here. If you're not a Christian, you're consuming oxygen, consuming food, consuming the time that is given to your life. You're consuming resources and impacting people one way or the other, but all of it for wrong purposes. That's not why you're put here. If you're not a Christian, everything you're doing in your life is for the wrong reason. You weren't put here for that. Whatever your goals are, whatever your reason for living and getting up each morning is, or may be, that's not why you're here. If you're not a Christian, you're living wrongly. You're put here to be a receptacle for God and to bring others to that same state. It means it makes all the world of difference. We were made to be with God, and you were made to be with God and to have God be with you. And we look forward to that in heaven, but we can have it here. Didn't He promise us, Jesus, right before He ascended, go and make disciples of all the nations? I'm with you always. He dwells with us. His final words are a reaffirmation, affirming once again, I'm with you, as it was always designed to be. Well, that's my message tonight, and thank you for your gracious attention. I hope this is encouraging. And if you're not a Christian, I hope this may lead you to rethink your life. Because what's your life? If not this, your life is purposeless or mispurposed. That's probably the better way to describe it. It's mispurposed. You're here, but not for the reason you were designed for. Live for the reason God put you here. Let God dwell in you. Be a living stone. Be part of His temple, His house. Be part of the solution to the problem throughout all of humanity. You can be part of the solution if God dwells in you. And if we are Christians, let's leave here tonight remembering God dwells in me. How do I live? How do I spend my time? With whom do I spend it? What things do I bring my life in contact with? What things do I choose to look at and to listen to? This temple, this vessel that's filled with God. Does that make a difference in our day-to-day decisions? It should. And let this refresh us and help us all to reset, perhaps, and rededicate ourselves to living as God's dwelling place. If you need to respond to the gospel, then do so right now while we stand and sing the song that was chosen.